Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're heading down to Panama City.
Panama City?
Yeah, Panama City. But we're not checking out the canal.
Oh.
Nope, we are diving deep into, get this, Feoclassical architecture.
Feoclassical.
Feoclassical. It's F-E-O, feo, meaning ugly in
Yeah.
Spanish.
Oh, okay.
We've got this essay, The Feoclassical Architecture of Panama,
Who's the author?
Darian Montañez.
Right?
And, of course, some background from Architizer.
Right.
Now, when you think Panama City, you probably think, like, skyscrapers, right?
A modern metropolis, yeah.
Yeah. Modern, sleek.
Glass and steel.
But apparently, there's this whole other architectural language going on. Montañez calls it deliriously decorated.
Deliriously decorated.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Me too. So what exactly is Feoclassical architecture, and why is Panama City seemingly obsessed with it?
Well, it's a great question. Feoclassical architecture is this, well, it's this playful, kind of jarring combination of feo, like we said, Spanish for ugly, and classical.
Like Greco-Roman.
Yeah, think like ancient Greek and Roman influences. So, you've got your ornate columns,
Oh, yeah.
intricate capitals, lots of decorative flourishes.
Okay.
But it's applied, well, liberally, sometimes even haphazardly,
On modern buildings.
Yeah. It's not about, like, strict adherence to those classical rules,
Right.
It's more about embracing a certain aesthetic, a love for ornamentation.
Okay, so it's not true neoclassical architecture then?
No.
It's more like someone said, hey, I like those swirly columns on those old buildings. Let's just stick them everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Montañez, he makes this great comparison. He says, the Feoclassical aspires to Athens, but produces Las Vegas.
Whoa. Okay, that's quite an image. So like the grandeur of ancient Greece, but through the lens of the Las Vegas Strip.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're saying, we want history, but make it flashy. But why Panama? What is it about Panamanian culture that embraces this unique style?
Well, that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. I mean, Panama's architectural history is really this mix of imitation and reinvention. They've gone through it all, from Spanish colonial to all sorts of modern trends. But one thing seems to stay consistent.
What's that?
Panamanians seem to have this deep love of ornamentation.
Yeah.
It's like no matter what architectural trends come and go, that desire for elaborate decoration, it always finds a way to come back.
So even when, like, 20th century modernism came through with all its clean lines and less is more,
Right.
Panamanians weren't ready to give up their love of all things ornate.
Yeah, it seems that way. Feoclassical, it kind of filled the void left by modernism's austerity.
It's like a cultural pendulum swing.
Yeah, a reaction to an aesthetic that maybe felt too stark or too simplistic.
Makes you wonder if there's something deeper going on here.
Yeah.
Is this just about aesthetics? Or could it be a statement about, like, how Panamanians view themselves, their place in the world?
That's a great point. And it's one that Montañez really explores in his essay.
Yeah.
He argues that Feoclassical, it isn't just bad taste, quote unquote.
Okay.
He says it's actually a genuine expression of Panamanian culture and identity. And he points to Panama's colonial past, the Baroque of the Indies,
Oh, yeah.
with all its elaborate decorations as evidence of this enduring love for ornament.
So it's not just some passing fad. It's like connected to a historical and cultural lineage.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, hold on. We can't just gloss over the feo part, right?
Right.
What exactly makes Feoclassical feo?
Well, Montañez himself, he calls it a glorification of bad taste.
Okay.
And to understand why, I think we need to look at the two main types of Feoclassical he identifies, popular and high.
Okay, break those down for me.
So popular Feoclassical, that's what you might see on houses, residences, or maybe in public parks. And it's often added incrementally, like a column here, a capital there, driven by, well, displays of wealth or commemoration.
So it's like, look at me, I've made it. I can afford to put a giant concrete cherub on my roof.
Exactly. Now, high Feoclassical, that's a whole other thing. We're talking grand apartment towers designed by architects, hence the high label,
Right.
larger scale ornaments. Sometimes they even import them from other countries.
Oh, wow.
It's a more deliberate, orchestrated version of the style.
So popular Feoclassical is more about, like, individual expression,
Yeah.
and high Feoclassical is about projecting a certain image or status
Yeah.
on a larger scale.
Exactly. Oh, there's also this related style called colonial.
Colonial.
Yeah, it mixes Spanish colonial and what they call Bellavistino aesthetics.
Okay.
Bellavistino, that refers to the style popular in the Bella Vista neighborhood in Panama City back in the early 20th century.
So it's like another melting pot of influences, just like Feoclassical itself.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're already seeing this spectrum of styles, from individual homes to these grand towers. But this all raises a pretty important question. Is Feoclassical just bad taste masquerading as grandeur? Or is there something more to it? Is this actually art? Or just stuff stuck on buildings?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, and it's the one that Montañez really spends a lot of time trying to figure out. You see, he argues that this love of ornamentation, it's deeply rooted in Panamanian history. He even compares Feoclassical to those temporary celebratory decorations you see at Panamanian carnivals.
Wait, hold on. How does a building resemble a parade float?
Well, think about it. Those carnival decorations, they're so fleeting, they're vibrant, excessive, but they're really only meant for a short burst of celebration. Montañez suggests that Feoclassical architecture, it kind of tries to capture that same energy, that same unrestrained joy, but it makes it permanent.
So it's not just about, like, slapping on decorations. It's about capturing a cultural feeling, a sense of exuberance, celebration, and making it part of the city.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And remember, he says this isn't something new, this love of ornamentation.
Right.
It's been woven into Panama's architectural history, going all the way back to colonial times. So in a way, it's a continuation of that long tradition, albeit in a more modern form, a more controversial form.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. But even if this is deeply ingrained in their culture, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good, right? There are definitely criticisms of Feoclassical out there.
Oh, absolutely. Critics argue that it's superficial, it lacks rigor. They say it's a bastardization of, those genuine classical forms. And some even just straight up call it ugly, which, let's be honest, is implied in the name.
Yeah, fair enough. So how does Montañez address these criticisms? Does he just ignore them? Or does he actually try to offer some counterpoints?
He acknowledges them head on, and he brings in some interesting historical perspectives on on the value of ornamentation. Like, he references John Ruskin.
Oh, the art critic.
Yeah, from the 19th century. Ruskin, he believed that ornamentation, that's what elevates architecture. It takes it from just construction to art.
So Ruskin's saying that it's the decorations, the flourishes that give a building, like a soul.
Yeah, that make it more than just a functional box.
Mm-hmm.
But then Montañez contrasts Ruskin with Adolf Loos.
Oh, the modernist architect.
Yeah, Loos famously called ornamentation a crime.
A crime. Wow. Okay.
He thought it was a sign of inferior cultures, like a backward step in architectural evolution.
So we've got Ruskin championing ornamentation as like the heart of architecture.
Right.
And Loos condemning it as a crime against good taste. That's quite a contrast.
Yeah, it is. And that's where Montañez's perspective gets really interesting. He doesn't completely side with either of them.
Okay, so where does he land in all of this?
Well, that's what we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive. Montañez doesn't shy away from these criticisms, and in fact, he makes a pretty surprising proposal for the future of Feoclassical architecture.
Okay, now you've really got me curious. We're going to have to wait till the next part to hear that.
So are you ready to go a bit deeper into this world of Feoclassical architecture?
Absolutely. Let's get into it. I'm really curious to hear how Montañez kind of tries to reconcile these contrasting views on ornamentation. I mean, we've got Ruskin praising it and then Loos calling it a crime. It's quite a difference of opinion.
It is, and that's what makes Montañez's take on it so interesting. He doesn't really side completely with either Ruskin or Loos. He sees the potential, I think, for beauty and for cultural expression in ornamentation, but he also recognizes that it needs to be more thoughtful, a more educated approach, not just this haphazard application we see sometimes with Feoclassical.
So he's not just saying slap on more columns, basically.
Yeah, right.
He's calling for a more refined approach.
Exactly. He actually uses this phrase, a return to sanity, to rigor. He wants architects to really study classical architectural theory, to understand those deeper principles, like proportion, harmony, balance, the stuff that makes classical architecture so enduring.
So it's not about rejecting ornamentation. It's more about using it in a way that's informed, intentional, not just for decoration, but to actually enhance the design of a building.
Exactly. It's about elevating Feoclassical. taking it from just an aesthetic choice to something that shows a deeper understanding.
It reminds me of something we talked about before, that link between Feoclassical architecture and Panamanian carnivals, that vibrant celebratory nature. I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around how those two things connect. It's not like buildings are suddenly sprouting confetti cannons.
Yeah, no, it's more about capturing a feeling,
Yeah.
an essence. Think about how temporary those carnival decorations are. Extravagant, excessive, but meant for a short time.
Mm.
Montañez argues that Feoclassical, with all its bold ornamentation and kind of like a disregard for restraint, it tries to capture that energy, that sense of unrestrained celebration and like embed it into the city.
So it's like saying carnival might be fleeting, but the spirit, the joy, the exuberance, that should be a permanent part of our city.
Yeah, exactly. It's about translating a way of experiencing life into the built environment.
And that ties back to what Montañez said about ornamentation being so rooted in Panamanian history.
Yeah,
It's not just about making buildings pretty.
right.
It's about connecting to a cultural legacy, to a way of expressing yourself through these decorations.
Absolutely. Now, to really see how this all plays out, I think we need to look at some specific examples of Feoclassical architecture in Panama City. Montañez mentions this building, the Venetian Tower.
Okay.
It's the skyscraper with a glass facade, but it's adorned with, you guessed it, giant Corinthian capitals, decorative flourishes, the whole 9 yards.
So we're talking a modern skyscraper, all sleek and glassy, but then they just stuck some giant classical columns on it. That sounds kind of funny.
It can be pretty striking, that clash of modern and classical. But remember, we're not looking at this through the lens of, good taste, quote unquote. We're trying to understand it as an expression of a cultural preference, this desire for a certain aesthetic that might not fit with those traditional architectural norms.
It's like they're saying, yeah, we'll take your modern skyscraper, but we're going to give it our own spin. It's almost rebellious in a way,
Yeah.
rejecting the idea that like ornamentation is outdated or a sign of bad taste.
That's a great point. It speaks to what Montañez calls the revenge of Panamanian architecture. It's like they're reclaiming ornament, pushing back against that modernist idea that it's, a crime, like Lou said.
This is fascinating. But let's go back to those criticisms for a minute. I mean, even if we can appreciate the cultural context, can we just ignore that some Feoclassical buildings just seem poorly executed? Like they took a classical design, stretched it, squished it, and just slapped it on without much thought.
You're right. That's a major point of contention. Critics say that Feoclassical often lacks that finesse, that understanding of proportion that makes real classical architecture work. It's more about applying ornaments than like really integrating them into the design.
It's like those home renovation shows where they try to fit in every single feature,
Yeah.
You end up with a kitchen island that's too big, a fireplace that's too small, and then a random column just there.
Perfect analogy. And it brings us back to Montañez's call for sanity and rigor. He knows Feoclassical has to evolve beyond that haphazard approach if it wants to be seen as a real architectural style.
So what does he suggest? How do you bring sanity and rigor to a style that, seems to be all about excess and playfulness?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Montañez thinks Feoclassical has the potential to mature, to become more than just a superficial way to apply ornaments. He sees a future where architects use their knowledge of classical principles to create Feoclassical buildings that are, well, not just visually striking, but also structurally sound and aesthetically balanced.
So it's about merging that love of ornament with a deeper understanding of those architectural theories.
Right.
Creating something that's both culturally expressive and, and technically impressive.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where cultural identity and architectural expertise come together.
It sounds like a tall order, but it's a pretty cool challenge. Okay, we've covered a lot, but there's one more thing I want to explore. The connection between Feoclassical architecture and social status. Montañez mentions that popular Feoclassical is often used as a display of wealth. I'd love to dig into that a bit more.
Yeah, you're right. That's a key part of understanding how Feoclassical fits into Panamanian society. It's not just about aesthetics. It's about social signaling, communicating your place.
So the more columns and cherubs you've got on your house,
Right.
the more you're seeing, look at me, I've made it.
Exactly. It's a visual language of success, especially in those neighborhoods where you see a lot of that popular Feoclassical. The more elaborate those decorations, the more you're signaling prosperity, higher social standing.
Like those peacocks with their huge tail feathers.
Yeah.
It's not just about survival, right?
Ah,
It's about grabbing attention, showing off, or in this case, showing off your financial success.
great analogy. And it touches on something Montañez brings up, this inherent desire for ostentation. It seems to be part of Panamanian culture. It's not just about showing off, though. It's about expressing abundance, celebrating success, and sharing that with the community.
So it's not necessarily about being snobby or elitist. It's more about expressing a cultural value. This idea of like sharing your good fortune.
That's a really nuanced interpretation, and it challenges that simple view of Feoclassical as just tacky or gaudy.
Yeah.
It suggests that maybe there's a deeper cultural logic at play, a different way of understanding wealth and success.
It's given me a whole new perspective on this. But I can't help but wonder, does this display of wealth create a sense of like division in society? Do
Mhm.
people who can't afford to participate in this ornamentation arms race feel left out?
That's a big question, and one we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive. Like we've seen, Feoclassical architecture, it's complex, full of
Mhm.
contradictions, ambiguities. It challenges our ideas about beauty, taste, cultural expression. It makes us confront our own biases and consider that maybe there are lots of ways to appreciate architecture.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain needs a break. When we come back, let's tackle those questions about social dynamics and what Montañez sees as the future for Feoclassical architecture. Okay, so we're back, and I'm still kind of hung up on that idea that Feoclassical architecture is like a way of celebrating success, and
Yeah.
sharing that abundance with the community. Not just flaunting wealth, but expressing a cultural value. But like we were saying, does it end up creating a divide between those who can afford to play along and those who can't?
Yeah, it's a real question, and one Montañez doesn't ignore. He's into the cultural side of Feoclassical, sure, but he gets that it could be exclusionary too. Not everyone's slapping those fancy ornaments on their house or living in those decked out towers.
Right, right. So how do you balance those two things then? Celebrating abundance, but also being aware of those disparities. Does Montañez have any answers for that?
He doesn't give like concrete solutions, but he does make some interesting point. He thinks the accessibility of Feoclassical, that's actually a plus. Remember those workshops we were talking about? The ones cranking out all those ornaments?
Yeah, the what do I call it? Mass-produced antiquity.
Right. And that's a big difference between Feoclassical and, say, traditional neoclassical architecture. That
Right.
old stuff, it was all fancy materials, skilled craftsmanship, only for the elite, really. But Feoclassical, with its modern materials and ways of making things, it kind of democratizes ornamentation.
Makes sense.
So even if you can't afford a mansion with hand-carved marble columns, you can still get a few of those precast concrete ones and be part of the cultural conversation.
It's like saying, hey, we can all play this game.
Exactly.
More room for expression, more people
Sure.
can participate. Kind of fits with that whole celebrating and sharing thing, right?
It does. It's like those community festivals where everyone shows up no matter what you make or where you're from, and you enjoy the music, the food, that feeling of belonging. Feoclassical is kind of like a visual version of that, maybe.
Hmm, interesting. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about Montañez's vision for for the future of Feoclassical architecture. He's not just analyzing it, he wants to see it evolve.
Right. Sanity and rigor, like you said.
But how do you do that? Inject those qualities into a style that's all about, excess and playfulness.
Yeah.
Seems almost like a contradiction.
It does, right. That's what makes his idea so interesting. He thinks Feoclassical doesn't have to be all about messy design or just slapping on ornaments. He imagines architects using those classical principles, but making Feoclassical buildings that are expressive and balanced, structurally sound,
Yeah.
even environmentally friendly.
So it's like taking those classical elements, reinterpreting them for today, maybe even pushing the limits of what Feoclassical can be.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine Feoclassical buildings with sustainable materials, energy efficient, new ways of building, but still holding on to that cultural desire for ornamentation. Finding that balance between identity and expertise and trying new things.
Now that's a future I can get behind. It's not about ditching Feoclassical. It's about challenging it to do better, be more thoughtful, a more sophisticated way to show off Panamanian culture.
That's the really fascinating part of this whole deep dive. It's not just about good taste or bad taste. It's about culture, history, what people find beautiful, the back and forth between tradition and new ideas.
We started with what even is Feoclassical,
Mm.
and now we're seeing how it connects to Panama's past, their love of celebration, maybe even pushing architecture in a new direction. It's definitely made me think differently about what makes a building, beautiful or what makes it matter.
That's what these deep dives are all about, right? Getting past those surface judgments and seeing how complex things are, how differently people express themselves. Even in something like architecture, that seems so permanent.
Definitely. Well, I think that about wraps up our exploration of Feoclassical architecture. We've gone from its history and what it means to Panamanians
Hmm.
to the arguments about its style and where it could go from here.
Hopefully, we've piqued your interest a little. Maybe you'll even take a trip down to Panama City and check it out for yourself.
Nothing beats seeing these things in person,
Yeah.
to really understand the little details, the things that don't quite fit, how it reflects the place it's in. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep on diving deep.